Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be stepping into the narrative side of drug policy, addressing how public fears, media messaging, and political incentives have created a long pattern of reactive and often punitive drug legislation. Our goals today are to understand how moral panic theory helps to explain public overreaction to perceived drug threats. We're going to explain historical drug scares and what they reveal about cultural anxieties. We're also going to explore how media and politicians fuel these panics, and we will also reflect on the long-term consequences of fear-based drug policy. Let's go ahead and get started with the theory behind the panic. Sociologist Stanley Cohen coined the term moral panic to describe episodes when societies dramatically overreact to a perceived threat, usually one that is framed as endangering societal values or public safety. He identified 5 key takeaways. First, there has to be a perceived threat to societal norms or interests. 2, a media exaggeration or a distortion of that threat takes place. 3, public anxiety or hostility towards the perceived wrongdoers is growing. And 4, we have involvement of moral entrepreneurs, meaning figures who campaign to protect the public good. And 5, we see a traditionally disproportionate response, usually involving the creation of hasty policy or legal change, or we see enforced crackdowns on certain populations. At the center of every moral panic is what Cohen called the folk devil. This is a person or a group who is symbolic of the problem. The folk devil is typically a simplified, demonized, and often blamed group, often in ways that reflect deeper anxieties about race, class, immigration, or youth behavior. Some examples that we've seen over the years: think of the crack mother, the Chinese opium den smoker, the cartel runner, the inner city teen dealer. The real issue becomes less about the drug and more about who is imagined to be using or to be selling it. As we'll see throughout this course, drug panics don't emerge from concern only. They're often constructed around these symbolic figures to justify swift and harsh responses. Sociologist Nachman Ben Yehuda expanded on Cohen's work in the 1980s and 1990s, focusing on the social mechanisms behind moral panics. He emphasized that moral panics are not random or spontaneous, but that they follow predictable patterns involving media, law enforcement, politics, and interest groups, and are often reflective of power dynamics, where dominant groups define what counts as moral and who the other deviant group is. Ben Yehuda also made the case that many moral panics are driven by institutional interests, not just cultural ones. He was especially interested in the role of professional organizations like police unions, religious groups, and media institutions, and how panics are sustained and legitimized over time, not just as public outcry, but as bureaucratic and political momentum. So why does this matter for us in terms of drug policy? The Cohen-Ben Yehuda model helps us to recognize that drug scares are not just public health concerns. They're socio-political events. We're not just reacting to substances. We're reacting to who is associated with those substances, how the media frames the issue, and what institutions gain by appearing tough on crime, particularly drug crime. This theoretical lens allows us to step back and ask not just what happened, but why now, who benefits, and at what cost. Let's look at some of the earliest U.S. drug scares through Cohen's lens. Think of the opium and Chinese immigrants from the 1870s through the early 1910s. As Chinese laborers arrived on the West Coast, opium use, already present in American society, becomes racialized. The narrative became opium dens are corrupting white women and weakening society. What was the response? The very first U.S. anti-drug law targeting opium smoking in San Francisco. Also in the 1910s, we see a connection being made between cocaine and Black Americans. In post-Reconstruction South, newspapers began reporting false claims that cocaine made Black men, quote, impervious to bullets, or more likely to attack white women. These stories inflamed racial tensions and helped to justify stricter drug laws, like the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. In the 1930s, we saw connections being made between marijuana and Mexican immigrants. As Mexican labor migration increased, so did concern over, quote, local weed. The plant became associated with violence and madness. The infamous 1936 film Reefer Madness was part of this panic. The result? The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which criminalized a drug that had long been legal. In each case, the drug wasn't new, but the target population changed, and so did the story. That's moral panic at work, using fear to justify social control. Fast forward to the late 20th and 21st century, and we see the same pattern. Different substances, yes, but the exact same playbook. The crack panic of the 1980s and 90s, we saw media portray crack cocaine as a uniquely devastating drug, responsible for inner-city crime, child neglect, and the breakdown of families. What was the political response? We saw the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 pass, which federally introduced mandatory minimum sentencing and the now infamous 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, despite them being chemically similar. In the early 2000s, we saw the meth panic, taking place, in which rural America became the center of the meth scare. Images of meth mouth, lab explosion, child endangerment all saturated the media. States responded with tough precursor control laws and child exposure statutes, but very little was done to address the economic or mental health conditions that were fueling this crisis. And then around 2015, we see the rise of fentanyl and the overdose crisis that takes place with synthetic opioids. The rise of fentanyl brought real public health concerns, but also political messaging around border security, cartel violence, and drug war escalation. While some policies have focused on treatment and harm reduction, others have pushed for harsher penalties, including capital punishment for fentanyl distribution. Each panic triggers real policy, often reactive, rarely proportionate. But what all of these moral panics have in common is that none of them happen in a vacuum. They require amplification. News media often latch onto drug stories because they're dramatic, visual, and emotionally charged. Headlines focus on extreme cases, like mom overdoses with baby in car, or zombie drug turns man violent, etc. Politicians respond by promising to crack down, to clean up the streets, and to gift tough. These policies often pass with bipartisan support because fear is politically useful. But the consequences can be enormous. Consequences focusing on mass incarceration, wasted public funds, and long-term stigma towards users, particularly along racial and class lines. As Cohen noted, moral panics often produce lasting institutional change, even after the public has long moved on. So let's recap for today. Moral panics help explain why drug policy is often driven by emotion over evidence. These panics historically focus on drugs associated with marginalized groups, turning public anxiety into law. The media and politics play key roles in shaping what and who is seen as a threat. And the outcomes of these panics, mass incarceration, uneven enforcement, and stigma, outlast the panic itself. As we move into Lecture 3, we'll shift from panic to policy design. How drug scheduling and federal law shape what's legal, what's not, and what the consequences are. Thank you so much for being here today, and remember, when the headlines shout, ask what's behind all that noise. I will see you here next time for our very next topic. Thank you, and as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.